greetings from Suli.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
While it may be true that the thoughts and lives of animals are not anything like our own, it is obvious that there are lessons to be learned from all of God's critters. If you start looking through parables, sayings, and stories, particularly children's stories, the lives of animals are probably the most common metaphors that we use. Although it seems we often miss the boat when we talk about animal lives, warping our simple perception of what's going on to fit the lesson that we want to teach. When it seems to me that the more complex realities of animal lives actually fit the more complex realities of our human lives. We've all heard, for instance, some variation of a baby bird is kicked out of the nest and learns to fly on the way down, or dies. Which we do love for a lesson of, at some point in your life, you need to learn to fly or be stuck on the ground, and flying is dangerous. Or sometimes we need to be kicked out of the nest before we can learn to fly, or will learn to fly. Or babies need a push before they'll just leave the nest. Well, the reality of first learning to fly is much more complex. Kind of like we humans learning whatever action we're using the fly metaphor for. Just launching into life being the most common one. Or sometimes also just jumping from one way of living to a different way, usually one more exciting and difficult than the one we start out in. Although baby birds are not generally kicked out on their own, going from being coddled in the nest to dropping like a rock alone in the world is sometimes reality for birds and for people. When I was living on a sailboat, there was a kind of bird, don't ask me what it was, that commonly nested in the masts. Many of the boats never did leave the dock. The parents never kicked the young out. At some point, they got tired of feeding them and just didn't come home. Yeah, I know a few parents of kids refusing to launch that would kind of like to take that off. Eventually, the young birds get hungry enough and they jump out on their own and somehow manage to fly before they hit the ground or the deck. And they seem to figure out how to find food too. And there are kids for whom this is the way it works. I was watching a reality show once, and one of the contestants told the story of how he went home on his 18th birthday, expecting a party, and found the house completely empty. Sort of like those birds on the boat masts. And while coming home to an empty home is probably not all that common, suddenly being on their own on their 18th birthday is the reality for a lot of kids. I belong to a quilting guild, and one of the big things that we do is community service quilts. And one of the groups that we commonly give quilts to are kids aging out of the foster system. When they turn 18, overnight, they go from the state taking responsibility for them to on their own. Often they're out of the place they're living with no support from foster parents and owning virtually nothing. We can't do a lot, but at least we can give them a blanket made with love. Most of the time, though, even out of the nest, birds are not on their own. The reason why they say that if you find a baby bird on the ground to leave it alone is because most of the time, the parents are probably close by, watching it, feeding it, doing their best to run off predators until the little guy can get up off the ground. What is often the case, but we humans kind of don't always get, is that being in the nest is not all that safe either. Sometimes getting the young out into the real world is both better and safer, even if they're not able to fly yet. After all, food is on the ground, and neither birds nor kids learn much when they're cuddled in a feather-lined nest. Kids may not realize it at the time, but when they're newly exploring the world outside the nest, Mom and dad are usually keeping tabs. In the real world, there are plenty of birds that need to be out of the nest well before they're capable of flying or taking care of themselves, particularly waterfowl. My partner has a house in Oregon, which sits within yards of an irrigation canal, and a pair of Canadian geese like the roof of his garage to nest on. While the eggs are incubating, whichever parent is sitting there on the nest, anytime we go outside, will be watching us with a steely-eyed glare. Now, both of us have seen baby geese on the water that are clearly too young to fly. So we wondered one day, how did the parents get them off the roof? Geese don't feed their young, so this needs to happen within a day or two at most of their hatching. Well, Google is officially a verb, so we Googled. They just shove them off the edge. Plop. Apparently, they're light enough to survive the fall and then a short walk to herd them to the water. They can't fly, but they can walk and swim and even dive. In the long run, flying is really important, but right now, walking and swimming and diving are what they need to do to survive. Although if you think getting pushed off a 12-foot roof when you don't have working wings is tough, geese are lucky they're not guillemots. Guillemots are a seabird that nests in cliffs in the Arctic. High cliffs, 400 feet high cliffs. Unfortunately for guillemot chicks, their long-term survivability is greatly improved if they get off those cliffs and into the water several weeks before their wings are developed enough to fly. So in about 4 weeks, the chicks walk out to the edge of the ledge, and sometimes with a little nudge, off they go, dad following right behind. They need to glide parachute all the way down to the ocean. The ones that don't make it to the ocean, they hit the land looking like someone tossed a football. They bounce and tumble in all odd directions. Really, laughed my butt off. I'm sorry. It's embarrassing how funny it is. But they seem to survive it. However, a very dangerous place, the land. Once the chicks stop bouncing, dad does his best to get it to the water before a fox comes along and finds it. They're all waiting as 100,000 chicks come off those cliffs in a space of 3 days. Almost all of them do make it to the water though. Now the chick has 3 or 4 weeks before its wings are developed enough to fly. And food, by the way, is a 400-foot dive into the water. We think we got it rough. But the father stays with the chick, feeding it and watching it until they can dive deep enough and fly, which may lead you to wonder, how does a guillemot chick learn to fly? Or geese? Fact is, a lot of birds nest on the ground, and there's no chance for that learn to fly jumping out of the nest scenario. For most humans, this is going to be our option too. Around our property in Palermo, we have a pile of wild turkeys. It's watered and we don't have dogs, and in the summer, we usually have a few hen turkeys hanging out with the chicks. Having always heard the kick the baby birds and they learn to fly on the way down, I wondered how they learn to fly. Turkeys are not much flyers anyway. They have big old long legs and mostly run. And those birds can get up and run too. They only fly when they're really pressed, and you can hear that they work at it. In fact, about the only reason they do fly is to roost at night or to get away from predators. Since no matter how good a bird runs, unless you're an ostrich and you can kick the shenanigans out of something, being able to get off the ground is a pretty good idea. When the hens first appear with the chicks, the babies clearly don't have enough wings to fly. They have a surprising amount of leg though. And when they got them, those little guys get up and run like heck, flapping their little wings wildly. The wing flapping helps them run faster. And before they're very big, they're lifting themselves off the ground. I startled a hen and her chicks out of my squash pack one day, and one of the chicks flew right up to the roof of the house. It wasn't but 6 or 7 inches tall, which, considering that an adult turkey's about that big, was pretty impressive. Quail are the same. We have a lot of those too. Quail mostly deal with predators by hiding. They love brush piles and blackberry brambles. Like turkeys, though, they mostly run. Unlike turkeys, though, they have little bitty legs that move about 1 zillion miles an hour when they're running. Like turkeys, though, If they don't feel like running's getting them somewhere fast enough, they take to the wing with the flutter and just go there. And like turkeys, the babies run like crazy after their parents and flap their wings at a remarkably young age, are lifting themselves off the ground. Young geese and ducks are pretty much the same thing. Ducks and geese are seriously not runners. The word waddle comes right to mind. But they start running across the water, flapping their wings and slapping the water with those big old webbed feet until they either lift themselves up off the water or settle back down. I guess Jesus isn't the only water walker. Most of us are probably like turkeys or geese. We're actually just fine with our life on the ground. We just do what we do because that's what we need to do, and we will continue to do for our whole lives. But while we're at it, we flap our wings when it helps us out, or when we feel like it, or when we can, and one day we find we can get off the ground. And then, like geese, when we need to be somewhere else, or like turkeys, if we don't like the look of that dog, we can take to the wing as we need to, and then get back to real life. Now, turkeys and quail nesting on the ground is not a big surprise. Like I said, they run like heck. But eagles are serious flyers. They court on the wing, they hunt on the wing. But in the Arctic, there are no trees, and Arctic eagles nest on the ground. They don't take off running like turkeys, but they will repeatedly jump into the air, flapping their wings like crazy, pretending they can fly, dreaming they can fly, wanting to fly. Oh God, help me fly, until they fly. Now I think of eagles like Marines, right? They're the do or die of the bird world. I never really thought of them as the fake it till you make it crowd. But when it comes to learning to fly, Arctic eagles just keep faking it till they're making it. And some of us are kind of like Arctic eagles. We're not really ground dwellers, and we're definitely not runners. But here we are on the ground, and we gotta fly. So we just run and jump and try and pretend and fake it till we make it. Flap our wings and jump into the air until we're flying. Then we leave that silly running around on the ground stuff behind us. By the way, eagles that nest up high don't actually push that young out either. They usually fly around taunting them with food, or just the act of flying until they decide to jump out and try it. And that's a scenario that fits a lot of us at some point in our life. We see somebody doing something we want to do, and the more we watch them, the more we want to do it, until we decide to take a chance and try it. As easy as falling off a cliff. We kind of like to push our kids toward the sky. Not that the sky is bad, by the way. An albatross spends most of its life more of its life in the air than it does on the ground. They're graceful and controlled on the wing, awkward and clumsy on the ground. It helps to pay attention to who you are. Life works better to embrace your strengths and not rely on your weaknesses. Turkeys, they spend most of their time on the ground. They're smooth and efficient runners, noisy and inefficient flyers. Albatross only find food on the wing, covering miles of ocean looking for fish close to the surface. Turkeys only find food on the ground, digging and pecking. But this is not to say that sometimes someone just doesn't want to be what they were born to be, like Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the book. It was a huge bestseller when I was in high school. No, I'm not telling you when that was. It was written by a guy who mostly wrote books on flying airplanes. This was his one foray into fantasy and philosophy. The gist of the story is that one seagull, John, decides he is in love with flying and rejects the squawking and fighting for food that the other seagulls do, and spends his time learning to be a better flyer. Of course, the other seagulls do reprimand him for barreling through the lunch crowd because he decides to do a power dive like a swallow and couldn't pull up in time. But he just can't let go of his love of flying until he finds the perfection of flying and thus reaches a higher plane. I highly recommend the book, by the way. And that's some of us too. We know life would be easier if we stayed on the ground. After all, these turkey legs can really get up and go, but we want to fly anyway. And to some extent, I think most parents want that to be their kid, to chafe so at the bonds of the life they were born into, to not be able to do anything but reach for the sky, no matter the consequences, and in the end, become something greater than what they started out. And as parents, when we're encouraging our kids to take a chance and reach for the sky, we promise we won't discourage them for pursuing a career in stand-up comedy just because we're afraid they may end up wallowing in the mud and on the ground instead of soaring to new planes of existence. I think this may be the lesson we're really trying to give kids with the baby bird gets kicked out of the nest metaphor. Yeah, it's scary, but take a chance. You can go from earthbound to flights of fancy. Don't think you don't have wings just because you've never used them. Maybe you just need a push.